Joining me today on Brief Encounters is Reena SenGupta. Reena is a long-time consultant, writer, and strategist in the legal industry. She's worked with global law firms, in-house legal teams, and legal tech businesses on innovation. And she's helped to shape initiatives like the FT Innovative Lawyers Program and the RSG India Report. Huge welcome to Brief Encounters, Reena.
Thank you, Richard. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, you've done a whole bunch of stuff in your career, from law, media, research, consulting. And when you look back, kind of what started all of this for you? What kind of prompted you to get into what you're doing today?
Getting into the legal sector was a complete accident. That was, I joined Chambers in 1995, and I went in really to help out on Michael's directory. He was trying to change it into a rankings book, and various things were going wrong. And I said, right, I'll come in and help you for a couple of weeks. That was the summer of 1995, um, and that was that. I went in for a couple of hours the first day, was in for about 12 hours the next day, and then for the next 7 years got bitten by the legal sector bug, and then set up RSG Consulting in 2001, and then obviously reorganized and became RSGI in 2021. And I guess that's, my God, that's about 30 years now in the legal sector. Accidents will happen.
And congrats on it. I mean, it's a wildly different place, I should imagine, now than it was.
Oh, completely, completely. I was saying to somebody when we were doing the Chambers guides, I invented that methodology before law firms had websites properly. Before we were properly, we were using email, but not as extensively as we are now. We used to send letters out, and I was trying to explain to a 25-year-old on my team what a franking machine was.
And it's such an interesting thing as now in the kind of software design that we do, when you kind of look at things like, document design, a lot of it sort of comes from what actually used to happen in the past. I mean, people used to literally mark things up in red pens and send them in the post. And, here we are 40 years later, and actually the documents look pretty similar. They're just on a screen now, right?
No, that's right. I mean, we used to cut, I think, half the Swedish rainforest down to create these massive books that used to go out on lorries around the UK. It was quite something. Anyway, it's very, very different world now, as you say, and going to be even more different, which I'm sure we're going to get into.
Looking forward to digging into that. And tell us, on the consulting side, I mean, how did that all begin for you, and how did you sort of get to work with law firms in particular in what you do?
So I was at Chambers for about 7 years, and when I set up RSG Consulting, it was March 2001. I didn't really know what I was going to do, but my first client was actually Allen and Overy. He said, "Come and do our CRM program." I'd set up these big research units at Chambers, did a huge amount of client research, and so I went and interviewed a bunch of their clients, and then lots of other law firms asked me to do that as well here in the US. And it was all about sort of looking at that client-lawyer relationship and saying, how can law firms deliver a better service, deliver a better product? And actually, it was through those interviews I did those for about 2 or 3 years, that the idea for innovative lawyers came, for actually ranking lawyers on innovation. And that was because it was such a supplier-driven market, and the clients were generally so unhappy with their law firms, and they would make these complaints, and then the law firms would listen to my reports but just do nothing about them. And I used to think, how can this supplier-driven market continue? Something is going to change. And then I'm thinking about, and then equally, how do these firms differentiate themselves from each other? There's got to be some way that they're going to do that, and it seemed to me that the way they were going to do that was innovation.
And take us back to those early days. Obviously now, law firm innovation teams are commonplace. I was just in New York for Legal Week, where there's millions and millions of people in law firm innovation teams and huge budgets going into it, a lot happening. But what was it actually like back then? I mean, was there even such a thing as an innovation team?
No. When we started, and I had the idea for Innovative Lawyers in about 2004, but when we launched in 2006, there were only 2 law firms that had the word innovation on their websites. One was Allen and Overy, and one was Eversheds in the UK. Nobody even knew what innovation was. When we started doing our research, we couldn't even use the word innovation. We used to say, where was the value add, or where was the wow factor? We had to, we had to use different kind of terminology because there was no definition for it in legal services. And it was, I don't even think that the firms thought that innovation was a good thing, was something that they needed to have. So, the firms I mentioned were ahead of a curve and were thinking differently. But there was a lot of resistance. The first couple of years of the program, I would have to convince law firms that it was a good thing to be innovative. I remember talking to the senior partner of one Magic Circle law firm, which I will not name, who said to me in an official interview, he said, the thing is, Reena, lawyers just aren't innovative, and we don't want to be innovative, and we don't even think innovation is a good thing. And in the corner, there was this PR guy who was sort of committing harakiri, going, no, this is about the FT's Innovative Lawyers Program. That's not what you should be saying. But he was wonderfully honest. And I do think that was the sentiment at the time. And then somewhere along the line, it shifted.
And what were those pivot points over the years from, it's always been like this, I'm earning £1 million a year, things are great, why change, to now? What changed?
So the first pivot point was the 2008 financial crisis. So we published our report in 2006, and I often say, and still say, that if we hadn't had the financial crisis, I don't think innovative lawyers would have continued. I think if the firms had enjoyed kind of double-digit growth and it had been sort of business as usual, I'm not sure we would have continued. But what happened was, even though it was a difficult time for the program because we didn't have any sponsors, because everybody was battening down the hatches, we were seeing lawyers do the best work of their lives. So in terms of the practice of law innovation, these bailouts, the whole kind of untangling of the financial crisis involved so much legal innovation that we were awash with content. And then obviously equally what happened sort of immediately after that was the recession and that whole idea of doing more for less. And so you suddenly had law firms and in-house legal teams sort of battening down the hatches and having to sort of really look at what they were doing and think about alternative legal services and outsourcing and all of those moments that happened around that time. But equally, what the crisis did was it was a reset for the role of the general counsel. So you found GCs becoming very, very much more powerful within their organizations. And so you had the rise of the client who's sort of looking at their law firms going, you need to be doing different things. And equally, they had to innovate themselves because their roles and their functions were changing within major corporations. So all of that together, that was one sort of major turning point. You've also got to remember, we started Innovative Lawyers before the smartphone. It's an extraordinary thing to think about that. But, in the first couple of years, we had, firms would send us things on CD-ROMs. I remember carting firms' CD-ROMs around with me from office to office. And actually, the smartphone changed. And suddenly, you had firms sort of thinking about the delivery of legal services differently. The whole thing about apps, would legal services be delivered by an app? And you had the rise of sort of outsourcing. And then I guess the next, I suppose, it was sort of that was probably the most significant turning point. And then around, 2012 to 2015, you got things like the rise of design thinking, human-centered design. You did that wonderful privacy notice. There was lots of movements around simplification and digitization. Obviously, technology was beginning to be used, and that's probably around about the 2016 mark. You've got companies like Kira and getting more and more traction. And then I would say another turning point was COVID. That accelerated the whole digitization process for law firms. And then, of course, the next one is Gen AI, and we'll see. We're still in that. We'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. We'll come back to this in a moment. Think about innovation. Some folks say this has become a bit of a buzzword now in legal. But for you, in terms of the work that you've done, what does innovation sort of mean? And in practice in law firms, in-house teams, how does that translate into kind of results and value for them?
It's still the same definition that we had for it in 2006, and I did a lot of work actually trying to define what it meant for a lawyer to innovate, and we came up with this idea. It's not novel necessarily, but which is that it's about creating transformative but replicable value for the clients or for people, for society, depending on what the stakeholder group is. Obviously, law is a service business, increasingly productizing, but it was is a service business. And so you've got to think about what is innovation in services, and that's a lot around the experience that the consumer has of those services. And technology kind of contributes to that. We've never ever equated innovation in legal services just with the use of technology. Unfortunately, lots of CLOs and law firm leaders think that's what it is, and it's sort of sidelined. For us, it's mainstream. It's in both the practice of law and the business of law, and which is what the FT Innovative Lawyer Reports covers. It's a holistic view towards how a legal organisation innovates. But of course, you're right. It has become incredibly ubiquitous, and it has become overused. And I do get lots of people saying to me, "It doesn't mean anything," and what we're profiling in the FT is not necessarily innovation. And actually, there is some truth to that. A lot of what we look at are point solutions. They don't always fulfill the criteria of replicability. So those are the entries that we rank as highly commended or commended. The standout entries in the report, though, are the ones that are replicable and are transformative. And I suppose we rank the others because we want to encourage everyone to keep on going. So that's why we'll include their efforts. But it's tough. It's tough to innovate in legal services because there isn't that much that's original, and you've got so many kind of peer groups doing the same thing. So it's very difficult to stand out, which is my original premise of this is a way to differentiate yourselves. But it's still tough.
It's really interesting, and of course, it sits across law firms and in-house legal teams, and we work with in-house legal teams and not law firms. So most of what we've learned is about within the business. But what are the typical differences that you see between the two, and how those teams think about innovation, and kind of what are the incentives and drivers for them to actually do it?
So up until recently, I'd say the history of innovation and what has excited me more has been the transformation of in-house legal teams. From that point, I was saying at the credit crisis, you saw this transformation of the role of the GC, and you constantly seen that go forward. The chief legal officer's got a much wider remit now, has much more impact, much more status in the business. We released a report a couple of years ago called the GC Decade, saying that this is the decade of the GC. They're really coming into their own. And so, of course, they've been innovating in a very fundamental way in terms of what they do for a company and the value that they add as both a enabler of business, as a strategic thinker, as a protector, as a function manager, as a thought leader within industry. We remember the general counsel of General Motors being one of the key lobbyists in Washington for driverless cars, and really sort of looking at the future of mobility. And he was a leading voice in that. So you've seen a real transformation of the in-house role. But equally, law firms are changing. So right now, I'd say law firms are racing ahead on the Gen AI front faster than the in-house legal teams are. So the in-house legal teams now are saying, law firms, show us what you're doing, we'll take our lead from you. There are with some very notable exceptions, but both segments. I mean, it's interesting. The first 10 years of the program. This is our 20th year of Innovative Lawyers, so I should say we're doing a lot of retrospective historical writing at the moment. But in the first 10 years, I would say it was the in-house teams. First 15 years, maybe the in-house teams. Innovating more deeply around who they were, rather than the law firms. But the law firms have caught up. Certainly in the last sort of 5 to 8 years, law firms have been catching up. A lot of that's pegged to things like design thinking, different roles within the business, digitization, the idea of productization. We remember when Freshfields put a product developer in every single one of their practice areas, and that's kind of what they were called. And that was quite interesting. That was about 8 years ago, you know. So, and then it gets unwound. You know, that's the other thing, is that firms start off these initiatives, and then they last for 2 or 3 years, and then it goes back again. And the same with in-house. You get an incredibly innovative GC will say, let's do X, Y, and Z, and then you get another GC coming in going, no, that's not what our function is.
Yeah, and it's so good also. I think for vendors, it's also quite healthy to have that because it's a great test of how fundamental the value you deliver is. And it's quite interesting with the influx of Gen AI and the very heavy levels of purchasing and buying, especially by, as you say, law firms, also by in-house legal teams, is, you know, how much in 2-3 years' time of that vendor stack will remain. And it should be, we think, those that are delivering unfair and sustainable and replicable value. And that, you know, we feel sort of a good thing for competition and for innovation.
Absolutely. And actually, one very critical component of the innovation journey in the last 20 years is obviously the rise of the third pillar of the legal ecosystem. So if you think about private practice and in-house, the third pillar being law companies, legal tech companies, companies such as your own, who are, you know, almost outside in innovation, but they've been pushing their profession to change, and really important and critical members of the ecosystem. Can't underestimate their role.
Let's talk a bit about AI. It's 2025. It's a podcast. We must. AI is obviously everywhere in legal content and increasingly across law firms and in-house legal teams. What are you seeing today as the way in which AI is actually changing how these businesses are operating?
So we're constantly asking that question, and we've just finished the research for the Asia Pacific FT report, and talking to firms in Australia and all over Asia and in-house legal teams. I think what we're seeing now are firms and in-house teams beginning to see the real gains of AI. You know, they're coming through. You're getting a lot of firms that now have full-scale rollouts, so every fee earner is using it and using it every day, you know, at some point. So the biggest thing that you're seeing is time gains, if you know, efficiency gains. Lots and lots of people sort of just doing things a lot faster. And the other component of this, which I think is really interesting, and I think the firms are being really smart about this, is that they're all focusing on talent and the in-house legal teams. The thing that's changing that may not get the same sort of fanfare is training, recruitment, resourcing, all of those things. They are making a lot of moves around thinking, you know, what kind of people do we need to become lawyers? Let's hire more technologists. I was talking to the chair of a Singaporean law firm this morning, who was really emphasizing the fact that they're recruiting a lot more technologists now. So their numbers are going to be the same, but they've got younger coders and programmers and Gen AI experts and data analysts that are coming into the business and are embedded in practice areas, working alongside the lawyers. And so I think that's really interesting. And obviously people like Richard Susskind have been talking about this message about the displacement or replacement of lawyers for a long time by AI. And I think what we are seeing is the point that we're in at the moment is that we're seeing real augmentation begin, and we're seeing lawyers improve. So what the excited law firm leaders and the excited CLOs are saying, actually, my people are getting better. They're getting better at their jobs. They're being enabled to do their jobs in a more kind of profoundly valuable way. They've got more time to focus on innovation. They've got more time to exercise judgment. All of those things. So that's the point that we're at. But it's very uneven though across the globe. You know, it's very uneven. And I spoke to a firm yesterday in the APAC region. All fee earners had it. They were seeing the breakthroughs. Spoke to another sort of Japanese law firm. They're still in the user, experimentation phases, still piloting. So that it's not even yet.
And really interesting what you say about how getting more time for judgment and innovation, should be fulfilling, whether you're, a fee earner or whether you're, another kind of person in a law firm. Do you see among your clients satisfaction among employees of, say, law firms rising as a result of this? Or do you see a kind of increased pressure for, well, now you're essentially a superhuman because you have all of these AI tools that can augment your work, and therefore we just expect to much more from you?
I'm an optimist, Richard. In terms of workplace enhancement, I think AI is going to make law firms much, much better places to work, much happier place to work. If one of the reasons everybody, they are deeply toxic, long hours, status-driven, hierarchical places that are not fun to work in for a lot of people. It takes a long time for a legal career to become fun. You've spent all those years doing work that is basically drudgery. And if AI can take that away and can accelerate the development of a legal professional, so they get into becoming a partner faster, they get into more client facing work faster, they get to use their judgment and their creativity faster, it's going to make it a better place to work. And if they're only working 9 to 5 and still earning the same sort of money, and they're not having to put in these ghastly overtime hours because they've got to do all this document review, then that's a better place to be. And I think that is what's going to happen. So I don't see it as continuing the current status quo. And I think actually, if you're running a law firm and it does, and you're still running a law firm that's got this kind of toxicity type factors to it, I think you're not using the AI right.
And it's definitely, I mean, as an ex-lawyer, right, who lived through that first kind of wave and now seeing what's happening, it is really hardening. And I remember as a kind of corporate lawyer doing due diligence with contracts, and you would be in a physical room and there would be boxes of documents. You'd try and find all the change of control clauses, and now, you use Juro or another tool, throw in all the contracts, and you get the answer, in a couple of minutes. And it really is kind of, you start to sort of see how the before and the after state, and it is really energizing and really, really exciting, I think. You, you talk in something you're writing about relevance of legal teams and law firms, and this is something I guess everyone is grappling with in this new reality, and this new set of circumstances. How do you stay relevant? What do you mean by this?
I think being relevant it changes all the time because the world's so rapidly changing. Right now, I would say for a lawyer to be relevant, or, be they in-house or in private practice, they have to have a very deep and extensive view of geopolitics and economics and understand what is going on in terms of trade, tariffs, and the relationships between countries. It's a really, really difficult time. So yes, there's a great writer out there called Sean West who's written this book called Unruly, and he's coined this term called geo-legal. And absolutely every lawyer needs to have a sort of geo-legal perspective to be relevant right now. And that right now, today, has currently trumped even being generative AI aware or even being generationally aware. I used to call it 3Gs. You need to have geopolitics, generative AI, and generational new nous. So it is all those three things. You still have to be conscious of those three kind of critical trends. But relevance is it's difficult for lawyers. I think they're in the middle of a perfect storm right now, and the storm just turned into, I don't know, a tempest, a hurricane, Trump's tempest.
I mean, it is crazy, isn't it? I mean, I remember reading, when I was in New York at Legal Week. Not only are you seeing thousands and thousands of people from innovation teams and vendors and everything else, and talking about AI, you also have the whole Perkins Cole episode ongoing. You have huge challenges in retention, massive changes to salary. It does feel. I mean, maybe just in my sort of professional lifetime, which is very long, it feels unprecedented. But actually, is this a good thing? I mean, maybe this is the shake-up the industry needs.
I don't know. I would disagree with you, Richard. I think it's a terrible onslaught on the rule of law, and it's very, very difficult. I don't think any of these US law firm leaders have wanted to do the deals that they struck with the US administration. And there was something in the FT that's just come out today where some Democratic rule makers have said actually it's possibly illegal what they've done. They're reacting to coercion and extortion. And I think what this is also showing, though, and we're going to be a bit optimistic, is just how critical a thriving big law private practice sector, and I include the in-house lawyers as well in that, is important to the functioning of government and society and upholding the rule of law, even if they're not directly, government lawyers or civil rights lawyers or whatnot. Actually having a buoyant commercial legal profession is absolutely essential to our stability.
It's very reinforcing what you say about geopolitics and the wider context. And it's quite interesting. As I'm a Freshfields alum, and Freshfields came out in support of Perkins Cole and publicly. But it's something that when you're in a firm and you're doing the work just day to day, it's hard to see the wider context of what you're doing. And suddenly, the sort of convergence of politics and technology and society comes to the fore, and you realize that law is important. And it's not just important for earning fees and everything else. It's important for the world. And I'd be really kind of curious what the internal discussions are like at these firms on these topics. And I guess in some cases we'll never know.
No, very difficult, I think, and very painful. But let's just hope it's just a phase. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. You've spoken quite a bit about law firms. In-house legal teams, I mean, we recently produced some survey data which talked a lot about burnout among the people in-house legal teams, and I think there's some evidence of this on law firms as well. The lot of folks now saying, well, okay, automation and AI should help to alleviate some of this stress and workload. What do you think is really kind of happening to cause these issues? And is technology the solution, part of the solution, or actually is this missing the point?
I think it has been a difficult time. And I think, during COVID, I remember a lot of in-house legal teams said they were like frontline workers, trying to keep the business going, trying to deal with, various sort of government bodies, etc. So the lawyers do work exceptionally hard. They have huge stress. They suffer from a lack of recognition generally, which is just actually what's interesting about having private practice law firms targeted by Trump. Suddenly they're being recognized. Normally, lawyers are just the unseen little eminence greasers, sort of making the wheels of commerce turn round. And but actually, the downside of when they're hidden like that is they work incredibly hard, do give a lot of value, and are rarely recognized or rarely sort of rewarded, or their contributions are not seen. And I think that contributes to that burnout and that stress, because where is your reward then? How do you feel good about what you've been doing? Which is one of the reasons why there are so many awards events. And obviously I'm author of a few, but there are so many awards events that thrive in the legal sector because they need that kind of external affirmation. But as I was saying, AI should reduce the hours, should reduce that drudgery, should take that component out. And maybe Trump will enable all law firms now to be recognised. Who knows? But not law firms, but lawyers in general. I think in-house always. It's interesting actually also on the in-house front, because in-house always used to be seen as a lighter career than working in private practice. It was like if you didn't want to become a partner, you went into an in-house legal team, and that's clearly not been the case for a good 10 or 15 years or so. An in-house legal job is incredibly demanding, and in some ways now has become even more demanding because within the corporation, you've become a lot more high profile. You get no thanks for saying no, but if you say yes and things go wrong, you get no thanks. And often, in-house legal teams have been seen as the department of no. So they're unpopular within their corporations, and that's a difficult place to be as well, I think, for in-house lawyers. But a lot of that is changing. It can also be. I'm interested in your survey results, because it can also be very fulfilling to be in-house.
It's interesting because we always ask as well, would you ever go back into private practice? And it's usually 100% or roughly 100% say no. So there is a sort of validation and satisfaction behind being there. But it's all the things you say we see. So it's the of course, the heavy hours and workloads, and the CFO says no to the budget requests for everything, and there's a lot of that, but also that emotional aspect of being the department of no, which I think is really curious. And you see some great leaders who completely shift that perception into legal being a revenue driver, and but actually a lot and again, you see it sort of in the survey data, but in the anecdotes, the junior levels in in-house legal teams is, folks want meaning from their workforce. They want reward, and they want to have, balance and flexibility. They also want meaning. And that meaning is the sort of intangible. So things like innovation and the ability to do great process design all really help with that. And that perception, that feeling. So yeah, it's pretty consistent, I think, what we see with what you're saying.
I think one of the sad things that's happening at the moment is that because ESG has been weaponized and politicized as a acronym and as a kind of set of issues and an agenda, ESG provided a real platform for in-house lawyers to do some really great work. It really elevated them within corporations because all of the ESG issues had some sort of legal component, and it was something that the lawyers and the GC often was the champion, was the ESG champion at the board level or in the executive management teams. And with corporations sort of dialing back on that, that source of satisfaction or that avenue is being cut off for the in-house lawyer a little bit.
And we've covered a lot of ground here. If you are listening to this and you're a legal leader of some kind, whether in law firm or in-house, what would be your advice to them for navigating what's coming next? What should they be thinking about?
For legal leaders generally, right now in the world that we're at, I think it's being very open and transparent about the displacement that AI may cause, and it's allowing AI to be used. It's being very sort of democratic and allowing it to come up from the grassroots level. So allowing people to experiment with it, because it's actually it is very motivating to be on the cusp of transformative tech and to see what it can do and be able to lead that. So legal leaders can give that to their younger people who are always very willing to do that. And I think it's being, as collaborative as possible. It's sort of saying, actually, I don't know everything as a legal leader. You teach me. In fact, the theme of our 20-year FT conference this summer is all about paying it forward, where we have the alumni of the last 20 years with a shadow panel of emerging leaders, and they're talking about all the lessons that they've learned, and the emerging leaders say, well, that is just not going to work for the next 20 years because the world's entirely different and we need a different skill set. So it's being really open to having those conversations and realizing that actually going forward, the law's not going to be about the grey hairs knowing everything. Wisdom is as much going to come up from below as it can from on high.
And this is such a great thing for innovation, right? Because so often the best ideas don't come from the top. They come from the folks doing the work and experiencing the pain and finding the solutions.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Reena, thank you so much for joining us on Brief Encounters and sharing your perspective. If our listeners want to learn a little bit more about RSGI or your work, where should they go?
Just to our website, rsgi.co, or read any of the sort of FT Innovative Lawyer reports. You'll see all of our work in there, all of the things that we know. Or just drop me a line, follow us on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Reena.
All right. Thank you, Richard. Thanks for inviting me.